All right, all right.
Yeah.
We're live. Hey, buddy. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
There he
Can
is.
you hear
There
me?
he is. Hey, man. Sorry,
Over there.
technical difficulties here, folks. We're trying a little bit of a different setup today, so thanks for joining us live on YouTube and or Facebook and a few other broadcast platforms. Michael, how are you, man?
Fine, thank you. Yes. Looking
All
forward
right.
to this topic, although it's never fun contemplating downturns and
Yeah.
generally, the rougher side of life. But I think we need to, seize it.
Yeah, absolutely right. Okay, so we are broadcasting live simultaneously in the call-in show app as well as on YouTube and Facebook. So, hot topic today, I think, important topic is going to be interesting to dive into with you. And so let's do that. You ready to kick it off?
Yes, let's do this thing.
Okay. All right, let's go, man. As is our custom, we'll do a intro here for the podcast, and then we will entertain questions that pop up as well. So feel free to ask questions throughout the show, and we'll get into it. Let's do it.
Okay. Just write one more word and then we'll kick it off. Running an e-commerce business in an economic turn. Let me try that again. Running an e-commerce business in an economic downturn can present intense challenges. Some will thrive and grow, others will struggle, or frankly, a few will sadly go to the wall. In this episode, we share 10 principles you can use to survive and ultimately thrive in a downturn. Jason, you ready to roll on this important topic?
Yeah, this is a great topic to dive into. It's hard to know sometimes whether you're in an economic downturn in your niche or submarket. Sometimes people go through these drastic changes in their small industry, where the economy at large is fine, and other times the economy at large is going to really struggle, and then all of us are faced with the question of what to do. So I think this is a really key thing to think through, and as we think about what the economy is doing broadly and where things might go. Obviously, stock market's been crushed the last month. Will the broad economic, markets sour, and will people be living in an economic downturn in the near future? I don't know, but this is important for us to think through. And so you've got some principles. You've got 10 principles you want to walk through with us that we use as sort of a framework and a outline to talk through the topics. Why don't you lead us into it, man?
Sure. I mean, so this is a frame. This is a framework for discussion because it's a huge area, and the response to a multifactorial, complex environment has to be multifactorial. But I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible so that we can go away and sort of have some things to hang other things on, as it were. So the first principle, I'm sort of going through from the point of surviving. Let me just do that clean again. I'm really going through from surviving and getting through the short term to then trying to be in a position to thrive in the long term, really. So that's the kind of order of events I put it in. So the first principle is price for profit. It's very easy to price for market penetration, especially on a marketplace like Amazon really encourages it. And that means that you're not really focused on profit, you're focused on market share. And that is a very dangerous thing to be doing, in my opinion, in a downturn or potential downturn. And to your point, Jason, I'm really glad you made that. There can be downturns within certain markets while other ones boom. COVID was an extremely extreme version of that when I had people in the mastermind selling, medically related equipment that went off the scale, and then people in the travel niche where it tanked 80%. So it is niche specific. But if there's a downturn in your specific niche, I think you need to price for profit. The profit then becomes part of your cash flow, which is one of the ultimate protections in a downturn.
So price for profit. What does that mean to you? You mean raise your prices? You mean
Potentially. I mean, it means don't. I suppose it's a question of focus more than anything else. Focus on profit rather than market penetration.
yeah.
I would say, for example, I mean, if you're launching a new product, then that's not going to be so much the case. Obviously, you price for penetration, but that's also a hint that you may be not thinking so much about pricing at launching new products into a difficult market, but rather consolidating your position in the existing ones.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I guess you should start with the question of, do you already have a price optimal strategy for
Mm.
a struggling or downturn economy? Maybe you already have the price optimal strategy. And I think generally though, but what's happening in a downturn economy is people look for low price alternatives. So I mean, if people are struggling financially, they're going to look for the same thing they wanted, just cheaper, and that their mind will shift towards cheaper substitutes. And so that's really the question: is where are you positioned against your competitors? I think in terms of your pricing, and that low price alternative approach, I think um, is interesting. So I guess I would say, pricing parity is important. Being positioned against a high price leader. Maybe the high price leader um, you just can't lower their prices because they have structural costs that won't allow it. In a time of economic downturn, I would say this: I don't think you want to be the high priced provider. But those are strategy questions, and this is why everybody's business is different and unique, and you have to think through what's potentially possible in my context with my competitors and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a great first place to start though is pricing,
It
isn't it?
is. I mean, as you said, there's a lot of nuance, and obviously you have a lot of expertise in a lot of these sort of more MBA type questions, as well as years of experience. I would say yes, it's not one size fits all. I mean, pricing for profit is a sort of subtle, broad phrase that doesn't necessarily mean that individual units should make more profit than um, they did before a downturn, for example. And as you say, you have to position against your competitors, but you do need to make sure that you're focused on getting a profit from the machine as a whole, I suppose, is what I would say.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, what's your second principle?
Second principle is using stock wisely. So again, this is related to the previous thought. And again, it's more of a focus thing than necessarily a drastic change. As you say, many people's businesses may already be well set up for a downturn, but I observe a lot with my clients that they're not always necessarily, especially if they're Amazon focused. They often use stock as if it's infinitely replaceable. And of course, when you have a supply chain crunch globally, which I think we to some extent still have or could have, particularly if the situation in Europe develops further. We don't know where that's going, but that is not a situation in which you want to just be gaily throwing your stock out of the door in again chasing market share. You want to think mindfully about the balance between cash flow, like you got to turn your stock into cash, versus your need to create profitable business. And all I would say is using stock wisely sounds a bit vague, and I suppose it is quite broad, but I think you have to be very mindful about that. Again, I would use stock to maximize profit, all things being equal. So
Mhm.
you don't just sell or restock because you're going to go out of stock. For example, you might raise your price instead as a way to prevent going out of stock, and that means that you make more profit on that particular set of inventory, etc., etc.
And so the idea here is that your stock is going to be potentially harder to come by, maybe supply chain problems, maybe you just need to be able to stay in the game longer. Maybe you need to make sure that you don't liquidate things and blow out uh, you know your inventory with low prices with the concern that maybe you'll have a harder time sourcing it, or maybe the pricing of your inventory will go up on the back end, and you'll go from marginally good, profit margin to problematic. So that's, I guess, the stock piece is interesting. This is not my cup of tea for sure. I don't think about stock in the same way
Yeah.
that you do,
Yes.
because I think about digital products, and digital
Of course.
products, of course, we don't have that back end cap or limitation. But so
Yes.
this is interesting. Okay, so this is great. Okay, what's principle number three?
Principle number three is cut early and cut ruthlessly. Now, before the show, you and I talked a little bit about product mix, and I suppose this is really where I'm going with this, but it could also be sales channels. In a time where things are harder, you don't want to be too experimental. So if you've got a direct to consumer site and you sell on Amazon, and the D2C site is going to take a lot of love and care to build, and it's not returning that love and money right now, then I'm not saying you should kill it, but you should probably put it to, into sort of maintenance mode or something like that. But more commonly, I would say an awful lot of people that I work with have a very, very big range of SKUs. And one of the people has, like, I don't know, 2,500 SKUs, maybe 300 on Amazon. And of those, I said, everyone should do an 80/20 analysis. And bless him, he went away and actually did one, came back with a graph where he'd done it all neatly. And about 10 of his products gave half of his profit. And really, what that implies to me, the flip side of it, is that he's tying an awful lot of money up in stock that's moving slowly, or maybe moving but not making much profit. And I think that now is the time, coming into a potential downturn. Again, it's market specific, to be willing to ruthlessly cut those, sell those through, and reallocate the cash where it actually gets a better return.
Yeah, this is reminding me of the old phrase Warren Buffett uses: when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And I guess as it relates to cutting costs and focusing on your profitability in your business is sort of a P&L view of your business, and asking the hard questions. What have you been blowing money on, thinking about expanding, or what have you been trying to invest into that you need to really shore up and think about being more um, wise with your expenditures at the same time. And I don't disagree with this one because you do need to cut waste out of your system. But economic downturns are a fantastic time to be the advertiser, to be the acquisition, hunter, to buy businesses and to spend money on advertising. It's in the economic downturn when everybody else is collapsing. If you're a powerhouse, you push your advantage, and
Absolutely.
that's a really important strategic level thinking exercise. Is, am I strong right now? And if there's an economic downturn, can I still be strong? And if so, will my competitors be weak? And if my
Yeah,
competitors are weak, what do I do? Um,
absolutely.
you
Yeah.
maybe you buy them. Maybe you advertise twice as much as they do. All of those kinds of ideas start to come to mind, and that's the reason you want to be lean, mean, and focused on cutting wasteful expenditures and working through your profit and loss statement. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're right to say it's about the wasteful advertising, wasteful product lines, wasteful sales channels. It's not about cutting per se, about cutting ruthlessly. I suppose the reason that I focus on that without giving the implication you shouldn't cut everything is most people I know are just not willing to let go of product lines ever. They run their product lines forever. And when they are physical products, as nearly all the people I work with are focused on that, then that ties up cash. And that is a wasted opportunity. And to your point, if you can run your business much more efficiently than your competition, if they are stuck in that sunk cost fallacy and you're willing to be ruthless and cut after a few months or a year or even shorter time, you should have spare cash. And as you say, then you can go on a shopping spree potentially. And that's one of the later principles. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's cutting waste, not cutting everything.
I totally agree. I love that. Okay, so keep going. What's your fourth principle?
Principle four is stash the cash. So you should always be, I think, in any business, mindful of having a good cash cushion. And you look at some of the great companies that are from the Jim Collins book, whose title escapes me right now, but the one that's focused on the companies that grew very well in very sort of choppy waters, like Microsoft, etc. They have famously a 12-month cash cushion, and I don't think there's a coincidence that they have been one of the biggest companies in the world for a very, very long time. Now, obviously, you've got to grow that over time, but I think having a mentality of growing cash reserves and using cash with extreme wisdom and focusing on cash flow, not just profit and loss, is really, really critical in a downturn.
Yeah, I totally agree with this one. There are a lot of little downturns that you can realize you needed more reserves for, and a lot of cash. We work with our charity in currency exchange, and even although the world might be not experiencing an economic downturn, if the two currencies you're working in have a substantial whack one way or the other, you can need a lot of cash sitting in reserve. And one time I was in a conversation, and I said to somebody, "Hey, we have basically like a 3 month reserve," and they were like, "Well, we have a 9 month reserve." And we were basically doing the same kind of business, and I was like, "Oh, they basically have a more pessimistic maybe mindset than I do, but maybe a wiser mindset." And what I would hate, and what I said to them was, I would hate for my optimism about the future to put my business at risk just because I'm a future positive thinker in the time paradox book framework. That doesn't mean I should put my business at risk. And so,
Yeah.
it's something to think through, and having a good solid cash reserve is vital. I remember just one last comment, and then I'll kick it back to you. But I remember in my favorite book, Growing a Business by Paul Hawken, he makes one comment about money, and that is, raise it or get it, borrow it before you need it, because once you need it, it's incredibly difficult to get, whether you're trying to get a loan or investment capital from somebody. When you actually need it, like you're in desperation, that's when nobody wants to give you any money. And so, you want to raise it when you're in the positive, upbeat, momentum mode of your business. So stashing the cash, I think, is vital. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the other way of looking at it, a couple of responses. First of all, um, I guess it's that old Greek Aesop fable, isn't it? Make hay while the sun shines. So, in other words, you could just laze around and enjoy the fruits of your labors when life is good. But what you really should do, I think, is do that to a degree, of course. But you should also recognize that life will not always be good. It will go through up and down turns for the rest of your business life. And if you're around for long enough, you'll see dramatic downturns and dramatic upturns. I mean, like the last 2 years over COVID have been both, right, in a very compressed form. So, yes, stashing the money when life is good. The other thing is, to your point about pessimism or future positive. The phrase that Bill Gates used, obviously the CEO of Microsoft for a long time, was productive paranoia. So thinking about in a useful, helpful way, not sitting around being chicken little. He built a giant company. Obviously, he had courage and vision, but also what could go wrong, and then how do we protect against that? And one of the best protections financially is just a huge stash of cash. And it also, a final point on that, I think it changes your mentality. As you said 100% correctly, you cannot raise money from a bank when you need it. But if you go into a bank and you have, say, 6 months worth of cash reserves and you feel quite good about life, the chances of you getting another 3 months worth or something, not only based on your economics, but they're based on your attitude and how you come across, and you will feel more confident, in my experience, with plenty of cash in the bank as well.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, let's keep going. What's your fifth principle?
Fifth principle is then kind of moving more towards the from the surviving to thriving mode, and thinking, as you said, about the potential of expanding. I mean, the truth is, couple of thoughts that are, I think, incredibly positive if you can get through the difficult times. First of all, many massive businesses were started in recessions, including, say, Microsoft. The second thing is when markets are smaller, they are it's the easiest time to get market share. And the time you want to be trying to dominate a market is not when it's giant and growing fast. It's when it's smaller because it's been knocked back, and then it's much easier to take market share. And in very concrete terms, for example, advertising costs are going to be somewhat cheaper if most of your competition is wiped out temporarily in a niche and is not advertising, or they've pulled their horns and aren't advertising much, as you said earlier, Jason. But I would say before you start, going on a spree, keeping your powder dry and waiting for the right moment is really important. So I think having plenty of cash and, like a good investor in the stock market, looking around for opportunities, looking at potential acquisition targets, potentially if you think that there are some businesses in your space that would make sense to bolt onto yours, or whatever it may be, taking IP from somebody who's selling up their business and paying for that, or other things like that. But I think taking time to look at the opportunities but not acting impulsively is really important if you're actually going to take advantage of a situation like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that one. And to my initial point at the beginning of the show, even just having money to spend on advertising, when your competitor's advertising falls off, can you fill the void and take some market share there? Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going. What's principle number six?
So principle number 6 is pivot your market if needed. So there's a couple of potential pivots in this because I think they're both different but really critical. So based on the star principle, I would say if you are in a market where the future is bleak because it's shrinking, for example, it's 2020 in about March, April, May, and you're in the travel market, as sadly a couple of my friends in London in the e-commerce space were, then you may need to pivot rather swiftly, and that may mean selling up the business, as one of them did. That may mean ramping up a service-based agency, as another one of my clients did. um, which really brings you to principle number 7, which I'm kind of putting together, I suppose, in one way, because they're both about pivots. That's pivoting business model. So you may need to pivot market if you're in 2 or 3 markets. And there are quite a few people in the mastermind. The prize is 5 brands that one of them runs, which is a bit extreme. But if one of those markets sort of turns to ashes, then you need to pivot your money and attention into the one that's working. But in that case, there was a pivot of a business model from being more physical product based to being an agency working on behalf of those Amazon sellers who were doing very well because their markets have blown up. So, in other words, you've got to really do what you need to survive sometimes.
Sorry. Yeah, totally agree. The pivot is vital in times of downturn. Um, the product mix is where my mind goes here. Is do you have products that are optimal for a down economy? Some people do. We do actually in our core business. We've always believed that we are optimized for the frugal minded economic downturn scenario buyer. And in Pixie Fair is what I'm talking about specifically. And that means that we know that when people have a flight to, kind of lower price options, they've come to us as opposed to the highest priced options in a market. So whether you have that or not, at the beginning of an economic downturn, you can certainly think it through for the economic downturn and reposition your product mix, and even what you might call the modality, which is digital versus physical products. In your example, somebody moved from selling something to a service, and that there are a lot of related services to any niche or industry that you could certainly pivot into if you're really, really good at running social media, really good at running advertising, really good at building websites, or copywriting. Any of those things can be a pivot that move you away from a product that might be less than optimal for an economic downturn to one that would be an interesting bolt on if it fits strategically with your business direction. Um, it's surprising to me, but interesting. In the last few years, Apple, which we all think is a hardware maker, has shifted more and more of their top line revenue to services, and they've moved into digital. Google with YouTube, moved into like video digital versus their core search product. And many businesses, ours little businesses included, can think through how do we pivot our product mix to something that might be more um, positive for a boom time economy and secure and safe for a downturn time economy. And it's something to think through. And I think there's a lot of options there. There are many, many podcasts could spin off just from that one topic by itself. But okay, let's keep going. What's your principle number 8?
Just one tiny response to that. I guess what you were talking about, getting the right mix of products, it feels a little bit like there's a famous way of putting a portfolio together that Ray Dalio, one of the most successful hedge fund operators ever, has talked about, which is really that if you've got things that go down in that respond to inflation badly, but other things that do well in an inflationary environment, and then the opposite and so forth, then what that can really do is create a very defensible portfolio that can actually almost have the best of both worlds. And that feels like the sort of thing you're talking about. So I think that's really great.
It's exactly what you do. If
Yeah.
you're managing more than one product, if you got a second product, then you've got the dynamic in which one could be better than the other in an upturn or downturn market, and that's absolutely what you want to think through. And then you've got a couple ways to approach any market. Where you emphasize one versus the other, depending on what's happening in the real world. So there you go.
Yeah, that flexibility. Again, the productive paranoia. Instead of going, there will never be a recession in my life because I'm a positive guy. Sorry, I'm still here. There will never be a recession in my life because I'm a positive guy. You go, well, there may be a recession, and if there is, we're beautifully placed to ride it out. And then you can be genuinely, optimistic about
Yeah,
the future,
yeah,
not Pollyannish at it. So
yeah,
yeah, principle 8 is timing your move, which is kind of similar to keeping your powder dry, but they're two sides of the same coin. One is if you think there's a great opportunity out there, don't start splashing your cash on foolish things. Without really looking into, is this really, for example, is this really a great time to advertise, or is it Amazon just inducing you to do so and make lots of money off you? Is it a great time to buy another brand, or will you in fact struggle to swallow it and it may not be a good thing,
yeah,
etc.?
totally.
So once
Okay.
you time your move, that means really you've had time to look at things, and then there is probably an optimal time to do any of these moves. I mean, for example, if you look at the stock market, it just spiked right down in March 2020. There was like almost an optimal week in which to acquire pretty much any stock ever in the FTSE in London, or in the Nasdaq, or in the S&P 500, whatever, the New York Stock Exchange. And I think that you get analogous moments in extreme times in any market, including in e-commerce. So I think sometimes there's just a sweet spot where you've followed companies for a while, you follow products, follow their product mix, you follow their advertising, and now's the time to strike. And that can be really when you transfer a lot of wealth from somebody else to yourself, if you get it right, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, what's principle number 9?
Principle 9 is what I call big fish shrunk pond. So it comes back to the good old STAR principle, or the Boston Consulting Group matrix, which is
Hmm.
in order to build a really valuable business or a valuable product line, or both, you need to be part of a rapidly growing market, and you need to be the market leader by some margin. So if you're talking about product lines, for example, you want to be selling pretty much twice as much revenue as anyone else in your market. Now, how you define a market, we could discuss forever. That's a whole podcast, but let's keep it simple and keep that principle in mind. The greatest time to acquire market share is when a market is small, not big. A simple seasonal version of that is you don't want to be advertising like crazy to build market share in October, November if you have a seasonal product for Q4 for Christmas. And in recessions, you get even more pronounced down and upside. So if you're courageous enough to invest in a market that's small but starting to grow again, that is when you can really dominate that market. And in the future, that market, once it's grown, with you at the front end of it staying the leader, can become very, very valuable. I believe personally that is one of the principles that drives the incredible companies that are everyday companies, that principle of explosive growth and value growth.
Yeah, you mentioned the Star book. Richard Koch is the book to me last week or the week before. I hadn't listened to it or
Just a
read it
great book.
before. And
Sits by my
I,
bedside.
yeah. Oh, sorry, you weren't on camera. Yeah. So, you know what is fascinating because I have a major critique of his book, which I want to talk to you about, and it fits in perfectly to this topic, which is um, he has two core principles: fast growing company and being the market leader, or being the market leader in a fast growing niche or industry. But here's the wrinkle: there are many, many businesses that are in industries that are not fast growing, but their e-commerce sales for that industry is fast growing. So, in other words, there's a different lens to look through other than just is the niche or industry fast growing. The question is the acceleration from offline to online sales happening quickly? And that is almost true of every industry or niche. Not all, but many industries or niche have old retail brick and mortar, uh, you know, uh, approaches
Mm.
that are not fast growing, but their conversion to e-commerce is fast growing. And I personally know of a good number of really successful e-commerce operators that slipped right into the middle of that, where they weren't a leader and it wasn't a fast growing niche, but because online they were early on Amazon or wherever, they caught the slipstream and really, really, profited from that conversion from offline to online. So
Mm.
anyway, to your point, I think there's nuance here because what is a large industry offline that hasn't converted to e-commerce sales yet is different than a large industry that's converted to e-commerce. And honestly, some industries go slower and faster than others. It's not all equal from niche to niche. So anyway, that's my kind of thought as it
Your
relates
critique.
to star principle. Yeah, it's not
All I
really a
would say about
critique,
that
just an
is,
interesting wrinkle. Yeah.
it's an interesting recall for sure. It's an incredibly important one. I would go back and read the book, because the very first investment that Richard Koch invested £1 million, so about 1.4 million bucks, and turned it to 100 million in his very first investment, and that was in a thing called Betfair. And to your point, offline, betting shops. So I've occasionally been past them, and they're full of old men in flat caps, smoking, and kind of grim places. I'm personally not a fan of gambling, but that's a different kettle of fish, right? So anyway, so there were sad little places that weren't growing that fast. When it went into its online version, Betfair, to your point, that was exactly the move that blew up his wealth, and that was his first of 16 investments, 8 of which have been positive return, which is why I take Richard Koch seriously. But you're absolutely right. Then a lot of markets go from offline to online and blow up in speed, and that is exactly why if and this is the key, you can stay market leader, they can become incredibly valuable for you. But what I would say is the best time to become the market leader is when it's small, because it's a lot less expensive. And then, of course, you've got to invest and reinvest to stay ahead of the curve and stay the market leader, which is the difficult piece, of course.
I think we need to do a whole podcast on this one because
We don't
there's a
agree.
lot of nuance there that's very interesting. Yeah. Okay. What's your 10th principle?
So the 10th principle really related to that you can grow by, taking market share from other people through advertising, whatever, and you can grow through acquisition. So the 10th principle is swallow the smaller, tasty fish. Um, but you may wish to reword that into something more tasteful. But I mean, go and hunt for, well, that's still a hunting metaphor, isn't it? Go and tastefully have chats to people who have businesses that are distressed and would like to get out of those businesses, and offer to acquire them at a reasonable market value. That's the most polite version. But either which way, there are people out there who have actually got, and I'm one of my mastermind members is in that exact position. They have a lot of assets and some beautiful design and a lot of things. What they don't have at the moment is a profitable business, and because of various disasters that have befallen them, that's not likely to happen, and they're moving out of that market. Now, that could be a great place. It would be a real win for him and a win for the acquirer to go and say, okay, so we've got let's untangle the stuff that's not helpful and not useful to us to the stuff that is useful. So they might acquire the stock. There might be some very useful intellectual property, some beautiful image assets, etc. So I think it can be done the right way, be a very very, very mutually beneficial for both the acquirer and the acquiree.
Yeah, no, this is really key. I mean, but this topic is really broad as well because Cinnamon and I have acquired 13 brands over the last 4 years, something like that. And people just capitulate at different times and say, they're ready to retire or that kind of thing, and want to sell their e-commerce business. And if you're growing and thriving and you have the opportunity to be a good partner to them in the transition of their brand, it is an opportunity. And I can't remember the exact number, but I think I saw something that said in the United States alone, there's like 800,000 businesses that close a year. I think it was in Roland Fraser's marketing for his acquisition, course. That is striking. And those people are, if they're not selling, then they're just saying we're done. And if it's in a niche or industry that you're operating in, and you can say to them, hey, I see value in your brand, in your product line, in your intellectual property and all that. Is there an opportunity then to be that go forward owner? And even in the COVID pandemic, I don't know if you've watched the growth of some very, very large e-commerce operators, which again, this will be a whole different podcast, but that have basically purchased retail stores that are going out of business. Grant Cardone is who I'm thinking of, and he's like Pier One Imports is a big store in the United States. There are other big stores that are sporting goods, that kind of thing, and they were going out of business. And he just bought all of their IP and their website domain and converted them into an e-commerce only operation. And he's done that with store after store. And so, you're right. This is a perfect, opportunity when an economic downturn exists to look for, the chance to see a brand that might, be valuable in your niche that you could take forward, that the owner might want to sell. So there you go. Yeah, I love that. Okay, that's the 10th principle.
Yeah.
Any other final thoughts on that one before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I guess a positive way of looking at this is, I think the word entrepreneur, one definition of it is that you move capital from a low yield to high yield environment. And if somebody has some intellectual property that have spent blood, sweat, and tears developing, and they're literally just going to close the doors and nobody will get you to use it, and you can acquire it for what is for you a moderate sum and saves you an awful lot of development time, or a patent, I mean, or a design for a product which saves you months and months and months of work. Um, then that is a real win for both sides, I think, because otherwise they are just going to shutter the doors and you're going to miss out on something that already exists and reinvent the wheel, as it were. So I think done the right way and with compassion, and taste and good economics, that can be a really positive move. Obviously, you have a lot more personal experience. I'm the guy sort of on the sidelines watching my clients selling and buying businesses with great interest.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting topic in and of itself. And we've done a podcast. If you're listening to this and are interested in the idea of acquiring other businesses, we've done a whole episode on how to do that, where I did some storytelling about what we've done and examples of how to do that. Okay, let's wrap it up, man. You want to do a summary recap, and we'll wrap up from there.
Sure. So, 10 principles for surviving and thriving in a downturn. Principle one, price for profit. You may already have a price optimal strategy. And to your point, Jason, thinking about your pricing relative to the market leader, which doesn't just mean increasing or decreasing. Principle two, use stock wisely. Don't just throw stock into the furnace of Amazon, particularly. Think about getting a return from it and potentially raising your price rather than just running out of stock. Principle 3, cut early, cut ruthlessly, particularly cut product lines that aren't working for you and wasteful advertising. Principle 4, stash the cash, having plenty of reserves and productive paranoia, possibly a la Bill Gates. Principle 5, keep your powder dry. Once you've got some cash reserves, don't go out and spend them too quickly. Be mindful about how you spend it. Principle 6, pivot your market if you need. Principle 7, pivot your business model if needed. And you talked about there's quite a few services that people have a lot of ability in. That's a fairly quick pivot for many of us if you have services that you are good at in your space. Pivot. Principle 8 is time your move. So if you are going to, use that powder that you kept dry, then make sure you do it at the time that is, if not optimal, at least good enough in terms of grabbing market share. Principle 9 is be a big fish in a small pond. If the pond has shrunk, that is a great time to grab market share. And principle 10, find potentially acquire other businesses that have been struggling a bit and if done the right way, that could grow both your brand and give those people some kind of payoff for their hard work in a distressing situation.
I love it, man. Great topic today. So if you're listening right now live with us, we'd love to have you hit subscribe on our YouTube channel or the player that you're listening to, or leave a comment below if you're on Facebook. And then, of course, we would love to have you give your highest and best review in your podcast player of choice. If you're listening to this on a podcast player, Spotify is my podcast player of choice, and I'd love to have people leave a review and subscribe to the show on Spotify. But if you use Apple, that's cool too. We'd love to have you show some support for the show on that player as well. Michael, as always, it's an honor and a great list today. This is really, really valuable content and important time-wise in the economy. And hopefully this show serves people well for years and years to come. So thanks for putting the list together and walking through these ideas.
Thanks, man. Always a pleasure to discuss these things with you. And I hope people find it's thought-provoking for their businesses.
Absolutely. Okay, that's a wrap. Bye, everybody. And we'll call it good there for the podcast. And for those of you who are watching live in Facebook or YouTube, thanks so much for hanging out with us. Any concluding thoughts, Michael, on this show before we end it? Oh, you're out. Okay. See you, buddy.